I hear water running.
Well, we are in what was once a channel for moving water. We're now on the bottom of the canal. So in our last little video, we were outside the canal. I was outside the canal. You were too, but nobody could see you. But right now, we're just in the canal. We're obviously in an abandoned part of the second canal, and there's a build-up here behind us. But you can hear running water going through one of the gates behind us. And actually, it's a muggy day today, so you can actually get a little bit of breeze coming through there.
Yeah, it's kind of a swamp.
Oh, we are in a swamp.
So this was a massive undertaking. This was dug
By hand.
by hand, by many hands.
Good point.
Many, many, many hands. Mostly by people who are new to Canada.
Yeah.
Immigrants.
Immigrants, refugees from the, in many ways, it's a bit early for some of them for the potato famine, but in the later stages of the construction of this, it's peak potato famine migrants. This is that period in Irish history where millions leave the country, where it's estimated as many as 1 million people died. Staggering story. But many of them end up in Canada, the United States, some in Australia, and there's this huge outrush of immigrants. And they arrive in Canada at the time when the settler economy is taking off, the industrial economy is being, a kind of developmental economy is taking off. And as one of our readings here, Pentland says, they really kind of stock the labor market. They kind of provide cheap labor at a time when there's these big projects underway where they're looking for cheap labor. And it is cheap. They're working for bargain basement wages,
Right.
Clearly.
Survival.
Absolutely,
It's just about survival.
Well, these are poor people. We don't always use the term refugee to describe those people. It seems to be more a 20th century word than a 19th century word, but they're refugees. They're clearly refugees. Ireland has gone to hell. This is a place that is in many ways the heart of the British Empire, but it's also the poor cousin of in the British Isles. It is itself colonized by the English, controlled by the English. They'll fight wars of independence to free themselves from English rule. And they have hit this period. The famine marks this period where their inability to control their own destiny becomes very, very clear to them. It will really prompt Irish independence in many ways. But just sending all those people here, poor people, they arrive with nothing. Many of them die in passage. At Gros Isle in Quebec, we have the memorial and you have a photograph from that in your reader. And also one in New Brunswick as well, where we mark the deaths of many, many thousands of people who made it to the shores, but who made it to the shores ill in some fashion.
Right.
With serious illnesses. They're desperately poor people, so this becomes what they can do. They don't have the money to start a farm, they have to work under somebody else's control.
And if you read some of the stuff in this chapter, they talk a lot about, stereotypes of how the people were.
Right.
It's interesting because you mentioned Pentland, and I read his first bit, and he has a section in it, and he calls them, he says that they'll work really hard for money.
Which they will.
Which they will, but then for themselves they don't work very hard. But then I was trying to find the source to that, and I don't see a footnote for it. Like, where does he get that? Like, as a historian, this is written in the 50s, where is he getting his source? Is this just his own common knowledge? Is this common, like, how do we know that that's true?
Well, that's a great question. And two things. One, at some level, you're absolutely right. We can just kind of work with what is commonly understood. We don't need to cite everything. If we had to cite everything, that would be ridiculous. But then there's also the way prejudices and biases and common misperceptions or stereotypes can often enter into a text. And certainly academic historians, we like to think we free ourselves from these biases, but we don't always. So looking at that passage, and there's a couple passages in there, but you've highlighted the one that really kind of screams to me. You wonder, well, how does he know that? Where did he get that point? Because it's really important to what he's saying. It really kind of underpins much of what he's saying. And if it's not there, it suddenly allows things to kind of go, oh, well, then maybe he's wrong.
And when I was reading the second article, Atkinson?
Don Atkinson.
He seemed to be saying the same thing, but is he saying it, or is he saying what other people are saying? Like, how do I determine his voice in this?
Well, I'm not going to answer that directly, because that would be giving away a little more than I want to give away. But you're raising an important point. Let me give this much away, that part of what you're pointing to certainly is not his opinion. Part of what he's doing is pointing to what other people commonly say.
Okay.
But I think it's up to you guys as students to really go through that text and think about where that came from and the voice that he's using when he's describing those things. And you'll see things like people have said, others have written about, that kind of thing, where he's pointing to kind of a view that's out there.
Right.
I'm responding to that view in some ways. And so look for that language, look for that, and that's historiography. That's what we're doing here. We're looking at viewpoints of historians, and that's what he's doing there. He's pointing to other people's viewpoints. So it's a really good technique for us as students of history to be able to recognize those conversations. And we've been talking about historiography as a conversation. That's what he's doing in that text. He's engaged in that conversation. So recognizing the language of how one would report on that conversation is a useful thing for us to kind of bring to every text that we read. See, he's talking about, or she's talking about that literature over there, those views over there, and I'm replying to them in some fashion.
Okay, that's helpful. And the other two articles really, to me, highlighted just how, even then as now, we tend to do a lot of othering.
Right.
So what is required for somebody to integrate successfully? So they talk about how it happens really well, I found, and then how it didn't. But are there other things that we can look for in those, about integration and what is required? Like it was primarily the church that was successful in allowing the Irish in Montreal.
Yep.
To actually become part of
Right, there's
the
that
community.
religious affiliation there. There's many more Catholics in Montreal than there are in Toronto. So
Right.
it's a place. It's a nice little illustration of where place makes a difference. We have in Canada in this time period we have two major cities, Toronto and Montreal, Halifax to some extent, but really Toronto and Montreal, and we kind of tend to talk about them as centers where immigrants arrive, places where industry begins, those kinds of things. But they're really very different places, and this is a nice illustration of that difference. So again, we talk about Irish immigration as a monolithic thing, but the place they arrive will affect their experience dramatically. So the people that are arriving, the other major debarkation place for Irish immigrants is St. John, New Brunswick, and they don't fare well there at all. And it's largely because it's a largely Protestant, Anglo-Protestant community, very orange place, meaning the Orangemen. We talked about the Orangemen a few weeks ago. This is really a kind of place where they hold particular power. Toronto is another place where the Orange Order holds particular power. Irish Catholics going into that context have difficulties because they're not welcome. They're viewed as other, to use the terminology that you're pointing to, which of course is we still do this today.
Still do it. It's interesting because of the lens, Irish seem so integrated into society now that they're almost, part of the mainstream. As I'm reading the 4 articles, and I'm supposed to be trying to come up with this question that
Right.
integrates these things together, can you give me clues on how I can come up with a really great question? There's questions in the book. I'm always drawn to just sort of coming up with those.
Yeah.
How can I extend my thinking and really dig deeper?
We've been talking about integration here. We've been talking about labor market integration, agricultural integration, integration into cities. There's a kind of word, and I think there's 4 or 5 words that you can think of like that you can kind of say, all these articles are kind of about that. And so a
Right.
question that used a concept like that or a theme like that to pull that all together, I think that would do really, really nicely. Again, I keep saying this in the screencast and so on, but there's no right question here. It's just something that usefully draws them together. And one thing we should be thinking about is, a lot of times, I've seen this a lot in student papers, where they'll find a question that unites. So this chapter we have 4 pieces. Question lovely unites 3 of them lovely, but the 4th one doesn't really fit. And so the person just kind of fudges past that. Well, that actually points to there's a problem with the question, that you might want to rethink the question a little bit. So don't fudge, try to find something that actually brings them together. And don't be afraid to step back for quite a distance too. It doesn't have to be, again, these people aren't directly asking the same question in their research,
No.
but they're getting at a similar topic and some similar themes around that topic, and that's where we want to be. We want to find a way to unite that together. Our topic here is Irish immigration in the middle of the 19th century. What are the big themes about that? What are the big approaches? They're looking at particular questions about that, but they're also looking at a general big question around that as well. Maybe they may not say it in their texts, but they're certainly looking at it. They're certainly interested in those larger questions of Irish immigration.
That's great. That's really helpful. I can't wait to see what the forums come up with.
I can't wait to see what comes out of this essay, because I'm so impressed with all of these little post-its with notes on them, and it shows incredible diligence.
Yes, this is my second set.
Your second set?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. You are setting the bar very, very high.
It's a good book.
Okay.